Hello, everybody. Welcome to session 10, Labor Zionism versus Revisionist Zionism. Our session today continues some of the discussions we started last time when we talked about labor Zionism as an ideology that sprang from various sources and was eclectic in many respects, but also created some hegemonic power in the Yeshuvim pre-stated Palestine. I also mentioned, as some of you may remember, the fact that the historians are debating about the way in which one should read and see the labor Zionist movement. And I've mentioned the debate between two key Israeli scholars, Ze'ev and Anita Shapira, both in front of you in the slide before you. And today we will continue some of this conversation. Famously, Ze'ev Sternhal was a very critical reader of labor Zionism. He considered the movement as trying to accomplish the impossible dream, an irreconcilable dilemma between two aims or two projects, the building of a nation on the one hand, and the desire to build a just socialist society founded on ideals of European socialism and liberalism on the other hand. And Sternhal was the one to argue that the labor Zionist movement could not do both at the same time, and therefore had to decide to focus their energy on nation building at a very early stage of the project. Now, to understand Sternhal's arguments, it should be mentioned that it is connected to his overall thesis about the nature of many fascist movements. Ze'ev Sternhal is a world-renowned scholar of fascism. His book Ni droit ni gauche, that is translated roughly into neither right nor left, a study of European fascism, especially in the French case, argued that fascist movements often sprang and emerged from left-leaning politics, but then the founding fathers of these movements moved a step forward and created something new. This is not a reaction and fallback on right-wing nationalism, but a new type of politics that took the idea of a revolution from the left to create a fascist society. So Ze'ev Sternhal's argument, therefore, is highly critical, and he identifies a quasi-fascist element in the labor Zionist movement. Now, quasi-fascist should be, of course, distinguished from the even more polemical hyphenated term National Socialism. This attempt to combine both nationalism and socialism is completely a false project to begin with. It is, of course, a highly polemical argument after the Third Reich. So this is the way Sternhal was complaining about when looking at the founding of the labor Zionist movement. On the other hand, Anita Shapira, a key historian, Israeli historian, founder of the Yitzhak Rabin Center for Israel Studies and emerita professor of Jewish history at Tel Aviv University, saw the labor Zionists in a very different light. She argued that it was characterized by ideological eclecticism, even ideological anarchism, and what she called termed creative inconsistency. In a sense, part of their debate surrounds also on disciplinary differences. For Ze'ev Sternhal, a political scientist, there's a clear theory, and the theory needs to be systematic and consistent. For Anita Shapira, the historian, humans can be inconsistent. There is a tension between the different values in the labor Zionist movement, and one could live comfortably with them. I mentioned this historical debate because I think it can illuminate some of the polemical elements that come with the history of labor Zionism, and that also translated themselves into key debates in Israeli culture later on. To clarify, this is not a debate between an anti-Zionist or a post-Zionist and an old-school Zionist. Ze'ev Sternhal never defined himself as such, despite the fact that he was well known for his critical stance. And actually, this is a very intra-Jewish and intra-Israeli debate. Even the biographies of our two individuals is very similar in many respects, Both are Polish-born Israeli Jews. Ze'ev Sternhell was born in a small town named Przemysl in southeastern Poland in 1935, and he's a Holocaust survivor. As part of his hiding, he had to pretend to be a Polish Catholic for many years. And when he was an 11-year-old, he fled to France in 1946, as taken by a Red Cross to France, and immigrated to Israel in 1951 at the age of 16 under the auspices of Youth Aliyah. He saw himself as an Israeli and never considered himself a post-Zionist. Nevertheless, as a political scientist, he argued that this was part of a inbuilt tension within the labor Zionist ideology. Anita Shapira, 5 years younger than Ze'ev Sternhell, took a very different approach. She was born in Warsaw, Poland, but grew up in Tel Aviv and educated at a Tel Aviv university. And from her very early stage of her career, she became a world-renowned expert on the labor Zionist movement. And for her, this was the movement that, in a way, prepared the ground for the state in the making. It is a very interesting polemic, and was only symbolic that both of them were awarded the Israel Prize in 2008 and found themselves sharing the same stage despite the oil and water approaches they represented towards that story. I started off with this historical debate because, in a way, it colors much of what I will try to do in this session, and which I subdivided into 4 segments. And equally, I will develop separate videos to avoid having one long recorded lecture. The first part of our session will discuss, in general, early approaches within the Zionist movement towards the so-called Arab question, and to see the creative inconsistencies, if you'd like, among the Zionists themselves when it came to think about the local Arabs. Next, I will try to say a few words about the new rules of the game that were established once Palestine was conquered by the British in World War I, and especially after 1922, with the creation of a new system, the mandate, the Palestine Mandate, that is run by British High Commissioners, but is under, if you'd like, the guarantee and the watchful eye of the League of Nations in Geneva. And from there, I will say a few words about the rise of militarist Zionism, something that we tend to associate only with revisionist Zionism, but actually has its role both in the labor Zionist movement and the revisionist Zionism. And I will conclude by talking about the radicalization of not only the revisionist movement itself, as much as the next generation, the second generation, which I call, borrowing a term from another historian, Jabotinsky's children, the way in which they radicalize the movement. So let's move right into the first part. Zionism and the Arab question. Now, it is often mentioned that one of the vicious paradoxes in the history of Zionism is that the attempt to solve the so-called Jewish question, Judenfrage as it was called in German, ended up creating a new question, namely the Arab question, or if you'd like, the Palestine question. It is also often argued that the Zionists turned a blind eye towards the native Arab population in Palestine and simply ignored them altogether. This is not exactly accurate. You do have mentions of the Arab population in many of the writings of the early Zionists, but when you look more carefully at the way they describe these Arabs and the way they looked at the future of Palestine, one could see the problem even in more concrete terms. And if you'd like, one of the best illustrations of that phenomena can be found in Theodor Herzl's utopian novel, Alt-Neuland, Old New Land from 1902. This, of course, famous utopian portrayal of the future Jewish state in Palestine, the one that Herzl believed would bring prosperity, progressive politics, welfare, and technology into that dark corner of the Middle East, the Levant. And in Herzl's book, there is an Arab protagonist named Rashid Bey. And he is a very positive figure in the novel. He is a progressive, is a very a gentleman who was educated at the University of Berlin. And not only that he's not critical or opposing Zionism, he's actually a full and active member of the Zionist New Society. Now, contemporary thinkers, using the terms that we use today, argue that here you see Herzl envisioning a state that would be both Jewish and democratic, both a Jewish nation state and a state for all its citizens, and how wonderful and progressive was Herzl's vision. But at the same time, one cannot ignore the fact that Herzl's attitude towards the Arabs was not only naive, but also highly patronizing. And one can illustrate it very nicely if we look at one of the scenes in the novel in which Rashid Bey is asked by the Prussian aristocrat Kingscourt, one of the other protagonists in the novel, what happened in New Palestine to all those old inhabitants of the land, the so-called falahin, the Arab word for farmer or agricultural laborer in the Middle East, those who lived in the land that suddenly disappeared when Palestine became so modern and technologized. And the answer Herzl put in Rashid Bey's mouth is indicative of his view. And here is the quote before you. Rashid Bey answers Kingscourt, quote, "Those who had nothing could only gain, and gain they did, employment, better food, welfare. There was nothing more wretched than an Arab village of Falahin at the end of the 19th century. People are far better than before. They are healthy, they have better food, their children go to school. Nothing has been done to interfere with their customs or their faith. They have only gained by welfare. The Jews have brought us wealth and health. Why should we harbor evil thoughts about them? They live among us like brothers. Why shouldn't we not return their kindly feelings? We Muhammadans, the old name for Muslims, have always been better friends with the Jews than you Christians." End quote, end of Rashid Bey's speech. So you can see, of course, that there is a clear patronizing view of the Arab that will only benefit from Zionism. And Zionism is, of course, equated here in the imagination with European technology, progressive politics, and it also downplays, or if you'd like, even ignores completely, not the Arab itself, but the very deep central clinging to the land, the attempt to see the land as integral and essential part of the local Arab identity. Now, if you look at other Zionist thinkers from the same time, you can see them not subscribing immediately to Herzl's view. And one of the best examples is, of course, Herzl's big internal opponent from within the Zionist movement, Ahad Ha'am. We've mentioned the fact that Ahad Ha'am and Herzl are not only two big egos clashing with each other, but also represent two very different approaches to Zionism, with Herzl representing political Zionism and Ahad Ha'am thinking about Zionism in cultural, or if you like, spiritual terms. And if you read the recollections of Ahad Ha'am from his first visit to Palestine in the winter and spring of 1891, you could already see him attentive very much to the Arab question and approaching it from a very different perspective than Herzl. And this is what he wrote in the newspaper Hamelitz that was published in St. Petersburg in June 1891. This is a milestone Zionist essay, and it was written, just to clarify, of course, a decade before Herzl wrote his famous utopian novel. He was visiting the first Zionist colonies, and he was very upset by seeing the following quote from Ahad Ha'am: "From abroad, we're accustomed to believe that the Arabs are all desert savages, like donkeys, who neither see nor understand what goes on around them. But this is a big mistake. The basic principle upon which all rests is thus not the quantity of our action, but their quality." And Further on in his famous essay, Emet me'Eretz Israel, Truth from Eretz Israel, Achad Ha'am develops this idea. And you can see how this critical approach towards the early colonists and the way they looked down at the Arabs as dark Orientalists is connected to Achad Ha'am's approach to cultural Zionism, this emphasis on the quality, not the quantity of the Zionist activities. Similar reservation, if you would like, can be found in the writings of Yitzhak Epstein, The Hidden Question, some text that originated in a lecture that he delivered at the 7th Zionist Congress in 1905 and was published 2 years later in Hashiloach, another Hebrew newspaper. And I would like to mention once again that this is not a criticism that comes from an anti-Zionist or a critic of Zionism, but from someone who was a key figure in the first Aliyah, a pioneer of the teachers in Palestine, someone who was involved in the innovation of the Hebrew language, and also a proud Zionist. And he opened his famous speech with the words, "Among the difficult issues regarding the rebirth of our people in its homeland, one issue outweighs them all, our relation with the Arab." Now, the title that Yitzhak Epstein chose for his our lecture turned article is very indicative. He's using the term question, the Arab question. And this is a rhetoric that might be familiar for many of us who are well-versed in 19th century European history, that is fraught with questions: the Irish question, the woman question, and of course the Eastern question and the Jewish question. Once people discuss these conflicts and problems through the rhetoric and the formula of question, they assumed, or at least suggested, that this is an unsolvable problem, some sort of a Gordian knot that requires a radical thinking, a radical blow, something that you cannot solve in the usual using the usual means and ends. If one of you is interested, I would strongly recommend looking at a wonderful book by a historian named Hillary Pierce on that exact subject. Now, Yitzhak Epstein is in that respect connecting what he sees in Palestine to the type of concerns and thoughts that a European Jew would bring with him to Palestine. But it's also very important for me to mention the fact that his criticism is based on personal testimony and personal witnesses. He lived in Palestine, and he saw the lands being purchased by Zionist organization and predominantly by Baron Rothschild's administrators that were buying lands from their owners. The owners, the Pasha, was often not, like many other owners, were not living in Palestine itself. And especially Yitzhak Epstein had the opportunity to look at one community of Druze Druze Arabs who lived in a place that was then called Tala. Today the Israelis know it as Metula, a tiny town on the Israeli northern border with Lebanon. And their land, the land on which this Druze community was sitting, was sold under their feet, piece by piece, to the Zionists by Baron Rothschild officials, and they fought. They were not willing to leave their lands very quickly, and it was Yitzhak Epstein that was looking at their struggle and with much empathy. He could understand the suffering of the local population, and that's what led him to write his famous speech. If we move forward in time, in chronology, and look at the first generation of native-born Israelis, the Palestinian Jews that did not immigrate from Europe, but already were born in Palestine, you see that there is a very interesting, similar love-hate relationship with the Arab neighbor. And one of the best examples or illustrations of that of this nativism and ambivalent approach, I think, can be found in the beautiful memoirs that Yigal Allon wrote that were translated into English under the title My Father's House. So just to clarify, Yigal Allon was born already in the Galilee and was growing up there in the 1920s and the 1930s. His father immigrated from the Baltic region in 1918. But the experiences of the son are very different from the one of the father. He was growing up in rural fastness, a bit like a Wild West prior to mechanization, a communal billy goat and a ram, and he can appreciate the local Arab, learn from him what it means to be rooted metaphorically and literally in the land, and he learns to appreciate him by looking at him as a farmer, but he also learns to appreciate them from the fist, through the fights, neighborly disputes that sometimes escalate into more serious disputes. So the Jewish village that he was growing up under at the foothills of Mount Tabor was a very picturesque pastoral area, but was already by the 1930s surrounded by a double wall and a barbed wire fence. And the young Yigal Allon was given for his bar mitzvah a semi-automatic Browning pistol that was, of course, unlicensed, which he already learned how to use. And I mention Yigal Allon because he's one of those iconic symbols of the labor Zionist movement and someone who will play a very significant role, first and foremost, in the creation of the Palmach, the striking force. As you can see in this photo in front of you, in the center on the right side, you can see Yigal Allon with this iconic hat that the Palmachniks used to see, and the handsome young man on his side is Yitzhak Rabin, the future prime minister of Israel, and both of them will play a very significant role during the 1948 War of Independence, and later will become extremely important in Israeli politics. Rabin is someone I assume I do not need to introduce you to, and Allon was Israel's foreign relations minister in some critical moments in Israeli history. But the Palmach was, if you'd like, one of those symbols of the labor Zionist movement, exactly because it showed the connection between the farm and the arm, what sometimes the Palmachniks themselves called the movement from Hameshek Laneshek, from the farmhouse to fighting fields. And it's not a coincidence that both Yitzhak Rabin and Yigal Allon, like many other members of the iconic Palmach generation or 1948 generation, were also educated in the same high school, the Kaduri Agricultural High School, just very close to Mount Tabor and Yigal Allon's house. This is what we historians like to call site of memory. It's something that it's a place that holds a special place in Israeli national memory. It was much more than simply a school. It was, if you'd like, the place where the mythological Sabra was seen to be growing. Even in Allon's own memoirs, the school was described in very rosy colors. Kaduri was more than just an educational institution, wrote Allon in his memoir. It was an educational and life-forging structure which molded the character of its students. And what the Kaduri school, the purpose of this agricultural high school was exactly to teach the young pioneers how to learn, how to work the land and become good modern farmers, but it would be from that generation and the same students that they will move, many of them, right into the Palmach. And the memory of the labor Zionist movement is very much connected with that seminal movement from the agricultural field into the battlefield. Our memory sometimes forgets the fact that these type of experiments were part and parcel of a general phenomenon that we see in mandatory Palestine. And the Kaduri Agricultural High School is actually a good example of the way our memory is sometimes fraught or very selective, because next to the Hebrew or Jewish Kaduri Agricultural High School, there was a Siamese twins, Arab-Palestinian Kaduri or Khaduri High School. Today, it's a college that is that is run by the Palestinian Authority, and the Jewish Iraqi philanthropist Sir Ellis Kaduri, who gave the money to create the two schools, believed that this is an opportunity that by modernization and higher learning, you will bring Jews and Arabs closer to each other, but actually they became two separated schools, the Jewish one in Mount Tabor and the Arab-Palestinian one in Tulkarem. But what is very interesting from a historian point of view is that if you look at the photos that are coming out from each one of these schools in the 1930s, they look strikingly similar. The same images of a suntan, muscular man working in the field, with the exception of the appearance of a kafia in the photos that are coming from the Arab Kaduri school. If you want to read more about it, I would recommend shamelessly read the article I co-authored with my colleague Tamar Novik about the unknown history of the Palestinian school founded by the Iraqi Jew. I was fortunate enough to join a group of Israeli academics that visited the Kaduri college in the Palestinian Authority several years ago, and it was a very interesting phenomena for, at least for me, as an Israeli that was familiar only with one of the schools and not with the other one. So our memory is fraught in at least in one sense. What is also very dominant in the way that the Chronicles of Zionism is written is that often because there was such an emphasis on labor Zionist values, we tended to forget that next to the fields and next to the kibbutzim and the moshavim, the collective settlements and the cooperatives, there was also another experience. And there was a very vibrant urban center that was growing, and that is, of course, Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew city that into the 20s and 30s becomes a real city with its own character, with its own coffee houses and cultural institutions. Much of the older historiography that tended to write the history of Israel through the vantage point of labor Zionism tended to downplay, if not even forget, this entire big experience. So that's for part one of our lecture, and I will pause now before we move into part two.